Welcome. How are you? Thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Jennifer Daly-Gress, and on behalf of the Equity Alliance of Western New York, we want to thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be here, to hear Dr. Jennifer Roberts, and just to be in the community space here. I'll share a little bit with you first about the Equity Alliance. First, I just want to acknowledge the planning committee. So we started as a very grassroots, literally sitting around a table at Scott Coffee in 2021. And eventually grew into a planning committee of 15 people hosting monthly luncheons with our intention of keeping racial equity on the table and creating opportunities for personal and professional connections out of our silos in the community, but then with the intention of moving that into action so that we can move equity forward in our city. We also started taking some trips to the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. Some of you all here tonight have been on those trips. We've now taken 4 trips to Montgomery, and about 175 members of our community in Buffalo have attended those trips. In a couple of weeks, there'll be another trip with high school students. About 40 or so high school students will be attending, and our next trip for adults will be October 7th through the 9th. So if you're interested in any of that, please scan the QR code on your way out the door. You can find out more information about the Equity Alliance, the Equal Justice Initiative trips, and we'd love for you to be a part of that. Now, it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce Dr. Jennifer D. Roberts. I met Jennifer through our work together on the Board of Trustees at Buffalo Seminary, where Jennifer is a graduate. She then went on to attend Brown University, and then she went on to Emory to get her master's in public health, and to Johns Hopkins as well for her PhD. Jennifer is a tenured professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Health, and we couldn't be more honored that she has traveled to Buffalo to be with us all tonight to talk about her work. So, Jennifer, thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm trying to project. My voice is a little soft, so I'm trying to project. But let me make sure I get my timer on because I don't want to have you guys here till 8 o'clock at night. In any case, I am so thrilled to be here. I'm honored to be the speaker, and I'm just, tickled pink to be back in my hometown of Buffalo to do this. I want to first thank Jennifer and Sarah for arranging all of this. They arranged it so that, I could come in, they laid out the carpet, I'm staying at the Richardson, just a wonderful, I feel like, Beyonce or something. And I also want to thank Bill and Marie for hosting the event. And then also, equally important, I want to thank all of you for sharing your Tuesday evening with me and hearing a little bit about my work. So before I actually jump right in, I want to make 2 acknowledgments. The first is a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge the land in which we sit or stand as the territory of the Haudenosaunee folks and Confederacy. And I also want to make an acknowledgement, a labor acknowledgement. And this labor acknowledgement is to really understand and recognize the exploited labor in which our country was built from the enslaved people from Africa. And even though we think of slavery in terms of the southern states, New York State actually had enslavement for about 200 years. So I'd like to also acknowledge that as well. So yes, I am a Buffalo girl. I've lived in all of these places for professional or for personal reasons, but mostly professional. But I'm always going to be a Buffalo girl at heart. This picture right here, I'm going to say it's circa 1980. This was either Fantasy Island, Crystal Beach, something, but I know I was having a great time. So yeah, that's me, Buffalo, a Buffalo girl at heart. So today I'm going to talk about Buffalo's inequities. But in order to do that, I'm going to have to step back in time and talk about some of the history, the beginning, the genesis of this nation. And I'm also going to focus on 2 groups. I'm going to focus on the Haudenosaunee group of people as well as Black Buffalonians, because I think those are the two groups that have really been, in reference to New York State specifically and Buffalo, that have really been marginalized and minoritized. And so I'm going to focus on them. And that's not to say other groups have not been disenfranchised, but these are the two groups that I'm going to focus on this evening. So to begin with, beginning of our country, it began with land dispossession, brutality, pretty much you name it, plain and simple. But before I even jump into that, I want to go back even further, even before this pre-Columbian era, and talk about the people who were really the first people to come to this land. So when we think about human migration, first of all, I hope we're all on the same page, that we all, as humans, originated from Africa. There's a plethora of research, genetic research, archaeological research, geological research, and that's something when you have multiple different fields who don't play in the same sandbox, having the same kind of emphasizing empirical research to show that we all originated from Africa. But in any case, we migrated, we landed in Australia, and then we went through Asia. But during the last glacial period, when we had the Laurentide ice sheet, that covered most of what we know as Canada, that covered New York State, that covered New Jersey, the Great Lakes, and the area known as New England. And so during this period, when it was at its peak, and so that means that was the most frozen point, that was about 20,000 years ago. And so at this peak, the sea levels were so submerged, about 400 feet, that the continental shelves of Asia and North America were able to kind of be exposed. And so in essence, you created this land bridge. And with this land bridge, it allowed humans to migrate from Asia into North America. And so this evidence shows that when folks came and crossed this land bridge, we see that we had the first, quote, Americans. I don't even like to say Americans because it wasn't even named America, and then it was Europeans who named the country America. But we had the first occupants or inhabitants of this land. And so we see that when they crossed the land bridge, they were able to then disperse themselves throughout North America. They went down to South America. And again, we see evidence that shows, genetic evidence specifically, that supports that the original people of this land originated from Asian populations. And so these folks are considered the Upper Paleolithic people. So throughout the next archaeological periods, the Epi-Paleolithic period as well as the Neolithic period, they were able to disperse themselves. They were able to kind of start to shift from being not so nomadic, but starting to create these kind of settlements. This was pretty much in the sense that they were able to adapt to the climatology, the topography, and so they were able to create these settlements in the sense that they were able to do farming and things of that sort. So it wasn't always a matter of, being nomadic. And so what we do know is that from this middle period to the Neolithic period, these were the first settlement sites of the Haudenosaunee people. So before European penetration, we had these settlements that were really, they were kind of starting to live their best life in the sense of creating these settlements. And they were able to start to work together, but there was some conflict. Initially, there were 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee settlements. And there was a little bit of conflict. And the story goes that because there was this intertribal conflict, that there was a peacemaker who was sent down from the Creator who said, you know what, we need to spread the word of peace. But he was like, I need some help. So he enlisted Hiawatha, who said, I will help you spread this word of peace so that we can stop this intertribal conflict. And so when he spread this word of peace, each nation said, okay, you know what, we're going to stop fighting. We're going to work together. And so they end up coming up with this great law of peace. And so what we have in terms of the nations, the initial 5 nations, from the east to the west, we have the Mohawks, Onondagas, sorry, my glasses are not that great, Onondaga, Cayuga, as well as the Seneca. And so they pledged that they would stop the conflict and they would work together. And they're known as the people of the Longhouse. And so that's an emblematic kind of way to represent in terms of saying that the Senecas, as well as the Mohawks, are going to be the keepers of the western and the eastern doors. Then around the early 1700s, there was a 6th nation who joined. They had moved from North Carolina, and then they joined into the Confederacy. And so they are now known as the 6 Nations. So again, during this next period, again, this agricultural revolution, we have these settlements, they're starting to live their best lives. You know, they're living off the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash. And they're really kind of having this very democratic society. And if you look back in history, the United States really modeled their democratic framework from the Haudenosaunee people. And so we see how they're able to work together. Even though they're individual 6 nations, they're able to very much work together. Until we reach the colonial period. Now we start to see some penetration. And this is the period where I start to think, who told these European colonizers that you could just come here and pretty much take over? Like, if you really even just think about it, like, it's almost like going to somebody's house and uninvited, and then moving into the house, changing the rules of the house, and then moving those people out. And I sometimes think, who told them that they had this permission to do that? And so I sometimes think that, you know, if they were having this conversation today, like how that conversation would go. And so I don't know about you guys, but when I was in Buffalo, you had long conversations on the porch. Well, you did a lot of things on the porch. You'd get your hair done on the porch, you might pick some beans on the porch, you had a meal on the porch, but you would have these long conversations on the porch. And so when you would have these conversations, I sometimes would think, what happened if somebody did something out of pocket or untoward, and you wanted to understand, well, like, who told you that you could do that? So I was thinking, if this conversation happened in Buffalo, it would probably go something like this.
Man, who told you you could do that mess?
Your mama did.
Nah, it was probably Jesus.
Girl, they always talking some foolishness over there.
Yeah, so you always had the neighbor who could hear, because the conversation would get, you know, increase in volume. So in this case, no, it wasn't Jesus, but it was the next best thing, okay? So in essence, you had these 3 popes, and these 3 popes, they wrote individual papal bulls, or rather these decrees that pretty much served as the legal, theological justification for European colonization. So if we start with Pope Nicholas V, he wrote his papal bull in 1492 to King Alfonso V of Portugal. Basically, in his papal bull, he basically said that, yes, you can invade, you can conquer, subjugate the Saracens, so specifically the Muslims, pagans, go ahead and go forth, and you can do that. And so around the same time, the king's uncle, who was Henry the Navigator, maybe we remember learning about Henry the Navigator in school, he was doing all these excursions. And he was really thinking about, okay, I need to figure out how I can go around the coast of Africa. But they had this kind of ideal that the ocean would have this boogeyman, and because sometimes you would have navigators go out and they wouldn't come back, so it was like maybe the ocean kind of just swarmed and ate them up. So he basically had to figure out how to do this successfully. And one of the things that he figured out was that you needed to develop the cargo ship. I'll come back to that. And so with the ship, they were able to gain a foothold into Africa. But even before they had the ship, they had this barge situation right here, which wasn't very successful in going on these long navigations. But it was enough to go and pretty much acquire the city, capture the city in Morocco. And so this is the point when they also start to capture some Africans. And so from his enslaved Africans, he had a conversation with one, and he was like, yeah, you know, there's a boogeyman in the ocean. Every time people go out and try to go around the coast of Africa, they don't come back. And this enslaved African was like, well, you're trying to go in that little boat right there. This is what you need right here. And so all of a sudden they started to have these cargoes, and then Henry the Navigator, he opened a navigation school, he put together some maps. All of his information he was obtaining from his enslaved person, his enslaved African. So if you really want to get some really down to the accuracy information, I recommend this book right here, Black AF History, because it really does show some really detailed history that is not censored. But in any case, once they had the ship, they were able to successfully go all around Africa. And the reason why they had to go around is because the Ottoman Empire was like, look, you're not coming through us anymore. I know you're trying to get to India, but you can't come through us. You're going to have to go around this whole continent. So they were able to eventually go around successfully. So then, Pope Nicholas, he wrote also another papal bull. Now with this papal bull, he basically said that he was pretty much sanctifying the seizure of non-Christian lands. So he basically encouraged the enslavement also of folks who were not Christians. Once the Portuguese got this papal bull, they just ran with it. They were like, wow. Also, they realized, you know, when they were trading with their goods, whether it was tea, spices, and gold, that one of the most profitable commodities were African bodies. So with this papal bull, they said, wow, we can really go get these now, and plus now we can go around the whole coast of Africa. We can set up these sites, these trading posts, and we can go and obtain African bodies because this is the most profitable. Plus, we have this papal bull from the Pope saying this is exactly what we can do. So it was really the Portuguese who pretty much are responsible for launching the slave trade and then the transatlantic slave trade. And so to this day, they are responsible for the majority, in these, especially in the first 150 years, of the highest percentage in terms of African bodies that were trafficked for the slave trade. So during this period, we have, again, like I said, the first 150 years, the Portuguese had pretty much obtained over 700 African bodies, but they were pretty much trading on the market and just making money. And in total, they reached over 5 million African bodies that they actually trafficked. Meanwhile, on the same Iberian Peninsula, Spain was looking like, what are they doing over there? And Spain also was doing a lot of stuff inland, and they also didn't have the same skill set in terms of navigation, but they were still looking like, okay, what's going on? Like, how are they able to do this? Like, we kind of want to get in on this. And so there was this gentleman named Christopher Columbus. Now, first he had gone and talked to the Portuguese. He said, look, I got an idea, y'all. I think we can go east to get to India. And they were like, man, you talking crazy. That don't even sound right. So then he said, okay, well, fine. So then he went to Spain, and Spain said, you know what? We will sponsor your trip, okay, because we kind of want to get in on this game. So when he came back and he successfully went to, although he thought he was in India, but he came back from the Bahamas and he's told them exactly what he found. Now we're up to Pope Alexander VI. And when he hears about this, he said, oh, shoot. Oh, I need to issue another papal bull. Because if these two countries start fighting, because now it's getting territorial, because now, you know, Portugal was really the ones who were doing all of the navigation up into this port, and now Spain was trying to get in on the game. So he still said, yes, go and obtain and conquer these non-Christian lands. He did it, I believe, in, you know, enslavement, but most importantly, he divided a line. He said, Spain, you can have all this of the New World, and Portugal, you can have all this. Like, the entitlement of, like, you could just have this. Like, it just blows my mind. So then, this was substantiated even further with an official treaty. So this treaty basically said, here's the line. And on one side all the lands that are found on this side is going to go to Portugal, and all this on the other side is going to go to Spain. So here's a map. You see, this is the line that was the original line from the Papal Bull. But then Portugal was like, no, I'm going to need a few hundred more, you know, I forgot the unit. Let's say it's feet. It's not feet. But I need to go a little further west. So this is the treaty line. So on this side, this is all of Spain. So they said, anything I find over here is for me. Over here, this is all of Portugal. And Portugal went all the way up to the line. I mean, all the way up. That's why Brazil is the only Portuguese-speaking country in South America, because they said, we're going to go all the way up into the line. So, meanwhile, these other countries were like, I don't know what you are talking about. Okay, this treaty, that's between y'all two. Okay, so that was one thing, that we're going to ignore the treaty. Number two, we're not even Catholic. So we're not going, I don't know what that Pope is talking about, so we're not listening to that. So France, Netherlands, Scotland, even though France was Catholic, they said we're going to kind of ignore that. So we're going to kind of get in on this game because y'all are doing some stuff that we are kind of interested in. So England really jumped in. They almost caught up with Portugal, even though they ended up finally with like 3 million. And then by default, the United States also got in on the game. But they had to stop in 1808 with the importation of African bodies. But by that point, they had enough for the domestic trade of slaves, so they were like, okay, that's fine. France got in on the game, and then also Spain. They said, okay, we need to catch up. And then also the Netherlands. So this third pope, this is an interesting situation with this third pope. Pope Paul III, he actually forbade enslavement and dispossession. He basically said, even if these indigenous folks, if they don't want to convert to Christianity, just leave them alone. And I was thinking, okay, why weren't y'all listening to Pope Paul III? Like, he really was telling you some knowledge. Then I realized he removed all of ecclesiastical penalties. So basically, he didn't have any teeth. So basically, they were like, well, we don't really have to listen to this. So in essence, people were like, we're just going to ignore that. But in any case, these papal bulls, particularly the first 3, are really the foundation of the doctrine of discovery, which pretty much is a principle that underpins the centuries of colonization and colonial and social and legal actions that were done by the Americas, that were done in Africa and elsewhere. And so this doctrine of discovery is like a doctrine that just keeps giving, because it really was the foundation of these 3 paramount Supreme Court decisions. And I think still to this day, Justice John Marshall might be the longest sitting Supreme Court justice. Don't quote me on that, but I think he is. But anyhow, this set the foundation in terms of what we understood for the title of land, what we understood in terms of federal Indian law, what we understood in terms of public lands laws, and the creation of reservations. So you can see how this has this legacy that keeps going and going and going. In addition, it set the whole kind of foundation for manifest destiny. Y'all remember learning about that in school? So it gave also this divine right that Americans thought for us to move westward. Not only to move westward, but to keep displacing the indigenous and tribal nations as we move westward. We would move them west, and then we were like, no, we changed our mind, we want your land, now we're gonna move you west. So it really was the foundation of this as well. It also really kind of instigated and kind of supported our need to move west, because we were trying to obtain this wilderness. Because we were all getting cramped on the East Coast. And we were like, oh, we need some land, we need some wilderness, we need some national parks, so that the white elite can go out there and do their national park things. And so it really was the foundation that supported that. But it had to be perpetuated on a myth. It had to be perpetuated on this myth of how you define wilderness. And so it really became this white construct that defined wilderness with this purity. It defined it as this place that you can go and be, the pure nature. But the one key thing that they defined it The myth was that these lands were unoccupied. And we know that is not true. So we had an Indian problem because this is the mythology that they were perpetuating. So we had to figure out, okay, what are we going to do with the folks that are already on these lands? So remember how I was talking about those other countries who said, I'm going to ignore the treaty, I'm going to ignore that other paper book, and we're going to get in on the action of colonization. So we had this North American expansion. So France came in on the game. They created Little France, which ended up being Canada. England got in the game, of course, the 13 colonies. You even had the Netherlands, who were in the game for about 5 minutes, and they had New Netherlands until England came in and said, okay, we're going to take your New Amsterdam, it's going to be New York City. Well, they just said New York. But in any case, they said, you know what, we're taking over. But in any case, you saw how we had this kind of rapid expansion. And with these, it was catastrophic depopulation of the Haudenosaunee people. And what is really just kind of devastating about it is how it hit them from all different points. It hit them in terms of intergenerational trauma, displacement, mourning wars because so many of our people were dying, so we were going to war, we were mourning to go obtain so we could keep the survivability of our tribes. It just, food scarcity. So much was going on when you had the penetration of these colonizers. And I'm going to talk about just 3 right now: environmental degradation, smallpox epidemics, as well as territorial loss. So, while there's no really reliable epidemiological evidence until about the late 1600s, we do have some accounts from some of the Jesuit priests who were there at the time and some of the other Europeans. But what we do know is that it was devastating in terms of the mortality. We do know that there were 3 succinct waves of years where we had a smallpox epidemic. Then you had these episodic years of more smallpox epidemics. And there was almost a 90% mortality. Like, could you imagine, like, just, and full like tribes were just being wiped out. And we saw that at a period, only 20,000 people had survived. So one of the reasons was because this was a vulnerable people. They had never been exposed to this. They had no immunity. And so it was really a naive population in terms of their immunological defenses. The other thing that we know is that the smallpox was weaponized. It was weaponized because when the Europeans saw how vulnerable people of the Six Nations were, they said, we're going to use this. And this is actually a letter from General Jeffrey Amherst. And he basically sent a letter to another general, and he basically said, you can inoculate the Indians by means of blankets. This can serve to extirpate this race. So this was really just your early, bioterrorism in terms of how to exterminate the original indigenous folks. Now for territorial loss, there were multiple occasions. I'm only touching on a couple, but there were multiple occasions where the Six Nations, they were brutally targeted. One example is the 1779 Scorched Earth Campaign, and it literally does sound like what it is. This is a situation that it still blows my mind. Basically, General George Washington, he basically said, okay, time out to this American Revolution, time out to the war activities. I'm gonna need to go over here and start to burn down some farms, destroy some villages, so we can come back to this war in a minute. I just gotta do this over here. So basically, he sent out this letter. You can't see it clearly, but I did have a magnifying glass and I was reading it. Basically, this letter tells General John Sullivan, destruction and devastation of their settlements and capture as many prisoners as possible of all ages and sexes. This was pretty much the action that he said that we need to do. And he needed this because he didn't want the continuous fight back from the members of the Six Nations. So he destroyed 40 villages and their food supplies. So I'm telling you this background because then when we get to the Treaty of Big Tree, This is interesting because this was probably took about a month long a treaty event that happened just outside of Genesee. And you had over like 2,000 Senecas who were there. And then you had some other people from the Haudenosaunee members who were also there. You had folks from the federal government. And basically, over the course of this, I call it negotiation because it really wasn't negotiation, it was coercion. But over the course of this month-long period, the Senecas pretty much signed away 3.5 million acres for $100,000. Oh, and in exchange, they got about a dozen of reservations. So you see that they were told, oh, you're going to get this large sum of money that's going to be great for you and for generations. And this was done with alcohol, bribery, intimidation, but also with the collective traumatic memory of just what happened with the Scorched Earth campaign. So you basically said, I better take this check, because if I don't, they're going to burn us up again. So they were like, okay, we're going to take this. Also, at this event, you had this gentleman named Robert Wars. He was a very, very ambitious speculator. And he basically was trying to buy up all of these public lands that we had and sell them at a profit to private investors. And so he had actually already bought these right of preemption. Basically, these rights he bought from Massachusetts, because during this time, a portion of Western New York was still kind of like operated by Massachusetts. It wasn't necessarily all like New York State per se, and so he had to buy these rights from Massachusetts. And because these are the rights in order to actually purchase the land from indigenous populations. And then over the next 2 years, he sold them to the private investors. And one of the people, or one of the entities he sold it to was the Highland Land Company. But the thing about it was, the Highland Land Company was like, you're not getting all your money, because we still don't have the title. He couldn't give it to them because the Senecas held the title. Hence the big treaty meeting. So he needed to figure out how I'm gonna get this title, because I need to get my money from the Highland land. So that is also the intimidation that was happening. And then you had the federal government there, because the federal government was there just to kind of oversee. Because during this period, you had the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act. And pretty much that act basically said, if any American is going to do any commerce, any trade, any sale with the indigenous populations, we got to control it. We got to oversee it. So that's why they were there, pretty much to make sure it was under federal control. Then you have the Erie Canal. And a lot of people may not think of the Erie Canal as a, quote, territorial loss, because it was really an engineering marvel of the time. Spurred this massive westward expansion. It facilitated the growth of upstate New York. But it did accelerate dispossession of land. And one example was that at the western terminus for Buffalo it resulted in the Buffalo Creek Treaty. And so again, the Senecas lost an additional 8,000 acres. Then you had the Oneidas, who were going back and forth. They had like over 25 different treaties. And eventually the land was taken from them, and some of them actually had to relocate to Wisconsin. So you see again this dispossession, and then people having this forced migration because of this Erie Canal project. And then also too, it rerouted natural waterways. And this is significant because to the Six Nations, they really did believe in the sacredness of the earth. And when you disrupt the ecosystems, when you change things differently, the traditional fishing practices, the trade routes, they all kind of change. And so this was completely antithetical to their belief, particularly their belief of the seventh generation principle. So basically, don't mess up the earth. Basically, make sure you have it preserved and intact for at least the next 7 generations. Then you also have land-grant universities. So even though the Haudenosaunee lands were not necessarily disrupted, so to speak, by New York State per se, for our land grant, our only land grant university is Cornell. I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention this as well. And so what's interesting is during the period, well, first you had Justin Morrell, who was really just, he wanted every state to have a public university. So everyone, because he really just believed in higher education. But at this point, we just came after, like, the Civil War. We were kind of like cash poor, but land rich. So they were like, okay, how can we establish a university? We don't have any money, but we land rich. So, because they were, at this point, they were over like $2.5 billion in debt. That's a lot of money for that period. So they said, well, you know what, we can start to give these land grants because we don't have the money, and then they could use the land to either develop it or they could use the land to sell. So this is an example of what the country looked like in this period. This is based on 1860 census data. So as you can see, we're all on the east, but right here, that's all unsettled territory. So that's where the land is going to come from in terms of the land I'm going to, quote, grant you. But New York State is like, how am I going to manage land all the way in California? So instead of actually getting the physical land, you got vouchers. So they were in the form of like coupons, per se. So they were land scripts. So New York State got the most. This was during a period that it wasn't 2 senators to a state, and New York State had, I don't know, I think they had like 8 senators or something. So you got the amount of scripts proportional to the number of senators you had. So New York State actually got over 6,500 land scripts, which is equivalent to about 1 million acres of land. And all their land representation came from the West Coast as well as areas in Wisconsin. This is equivalent to almost a $6 million endowment. Now, the other key thing about Cornell, Ezra Cornell was quite brilliant. So a lot of these states who got their scripts, what did they do? They started to sell it. So what happens when everybody starts selling? The value of it goes down, right? So Ezra was like, okay, y'all, we're gonna hold on to this. I know we need the money because we're trying to put this college together, but we're gonna hold on. So eventually, when they did start to sell, and also he established like this development type firm in Wisconsin where he was kind of managing the land. So eventually, when he did sell, they were able to reap so much principal. And to this date, they have the highest ratio in terms of 131-to-1 in terms of what they made from the endowment return proportional to the land that was bought, I put in quotes, from the tribes. So I needed to mention that as well. And to kind of end this little section that I'm talking about, we see a map of the 6 nations. We see how we have the Mohawks, Onondagas, Tuscarora, Oneida, Seneca, Cayuga. We see all of them, and we see their land. And they're adjacent to some other tribal nations to the east. But afterwards, they're now just in these little red areas. This is the post-dispossession, where they're just pretty much relegated to these reservations. So this just represents how much land that they lost. Numerically, you can even see how much original land they had, and then how much land area they have today. Now, the Oneidas, they were able to buy back 18,000 acres. And so they were like, okay, we should have the same sovereignty as we had when it was originally our land before it was taken away. No, the federal government, Supreme Court case basically said, no, you can't, because basically they sued the town that was trying to sue them because they weren't paying taxes, and it went back and forth, and then when it reached the Supreme Court, they said, no, you are not going to be granted the original sovereignty. You're going to have to pay these property taxes. So, in essence, they got screwed again, in my opinion. That is kind of that first story. This is the part 2. During this whole period, we also have this long period of enslavement. And during this period of enslavement, we see the brutality, we see all the most horrible things going on. But it does get to a point where we have freedom after the Emancipation Proclamation. But now we got a Negro problem, because what are we going to do with these people? I don't really want, well, half of the country said I didn't really want to free them. But there's a Negro problem, because we're like, okay, what are we going to do with them? And so we had this period where it was a matter of like, okay, let's figure out how we could still get free labor. Because we have free labor for 200 years, so we have to figure out how we're going to get free labor. So you had this idea called black codes. Now with the black codes, basically it was a way to pretty much restrict their restrictive laws of what they could and couldn't do. And so throughout the Cotton Belt in the southern states, they kind of varied on how their black codes were written. But one that was ubiquitous was one of vagrancy. And basically that said, if you were over the age of 18 and you didn't have a job, that was illegal. You were considered a vagrant. So, by default, a lot of folks ended up being sharecropping. And actually, it was an agricultural system that was kind of ingenious because you had a lot of freedmen who were like, well, where am I going to live? Like, what job am I going to have? I have no resources. So they ended up staying right where they were with their former enslaver, and they were kind of put in this sharecropping system, which really was just a perpetual system of poverty, because instead of getting wages, you would get a portion of the harvest, but you didn't know exactly. First of all, you had to lend against or borrow against the forthcoming harvest because you had to pay your rent, you had to pay for food, you had to pay for seed, you had to pay for the rental of the farm, just everything. So by the time the harvest season comes, you're still in the red. So, in addition, like I said, if you didn't have a labor contract, and even if you didn't have a labor contract that you could show, you would get caught up in convict leasing. So for any crime, innocuous, or not even really a crime, you could get swept up in this convict leasing program. Now you have to remember also, the South was torn up because of the Civil War. They had to build everything back together. And so with the convict leasing system, you had a situation where you had the courts, you had judges who had these labor contracts with the financial, and also with financial incentives. But they had labor contracts with the railroad companies, the mining companies, the steel companies, and basically they said, okay, with these contracts, how many laborers do you need and for how long? So like, okay, so then when the next quote convict comes in, they're like, okay, I'm gonna sentence you for a year because the steel company needs you for a year. So they would put these people out, and it wasn't like the judicial system today where like maybe get arrested and then you get arraigned on, like there's a process. No, it was like all boom, bam, boom. And there were some family members who were like, he went out for an errand and I haven't seen my loved one. Like he just got swept up in the system. So this was another way to get that free labor. So in addition, you also had a whole lot of mad white Southerners because they were like, I don't like what's going on. These folks are supposed to be free. They taking my job. There was just a whole lot going on. And so during this period, you saw this definite increase in terms of lynching. And between 1882 and about the 1968, there were over 3,400 lynchings that occurred. And what's interesting is that there was lynching that occurred beforehand, but with this, it became much more racialized. It became a racialized terror, a way to really terrorize free men and women. And so you can even see a difference between 1882 and then after 1900. There was a 5-fold difference in terms of the proportion of black to white lynchings. So you can see definitely how it became this mechanism for racial terror. In addition, a lot of these lynchings happened out in natural spaces. They became public spectacles. And so as a result, a lot of black folks developed this land-based trauma because they could remember and see their loved ones hanging from the poplar trees. Like it really was an outdoor event, and as a result, a land-based trauma. So with all of this going on, you had some folks who were like, I gotta go. I have to go. Even if I have to walk, I have to go. And so for many of you familiar with, we have the Great Migration that happened around 1910, 1915, all the way into the 1960s. So it happened kind of in 2 waves. Then the waves of the time period kind of mirror the time frame of World War I and World War II. And so they were drawn in, and they would go to cities to the northeast, they would go to cities in the Midwest, and then out west, all going for a better opportunity, a hope of a better opportunity. And one of those cities was Buffalo. Now, before the Great Migration, you had some folks settling in Buffalo, particularly before the Emancipation Proclamation, because they were on their way to Canada. But some folks, a small portion, said, you know what, I don't need to cross the Niagara River. I could just hunker down here and I'll just stay here. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, the population of black folks increased by 145%. They said, oh, I could just stay here in Buffalo. Then, during the 2 waves of the Great Migration, we see almost a 200% increase of the black population. And then during the second wave, another doubling. So in total, like a 400% increase of the black population. Meanwhile, the white population decreased in half. Now, they didn't leave the state or the country. They just left the city and went to the suburbs. Now also, before the migration, we had this large green space transformation. And this large green space transformation, as we know, is the Buffalo Park system. So, okay, let me tell y'all just real quick. I just learned how to use Chat GPT. And I made this with Chat. Okay, my students had to teach me how to do it. But I am so impressed. I literally just typed in. I was like, Frederick Olmsted, Buffalo. Put the little, and it came. I was like, look at this. So I just had to put this slide here because I really, okay. Anyhow, with this, Frederick Law Olmsted, on his way to Chicago, he said, okay, I'll stop in Buffalo. First of all, let me tell you, it was this American Park movement going on. And Central Park had already been unveiled. Well, a good portion of it. It wasn't completely finished until the 70s. But people started to see like, wow, look at this park. So you had other cities, especially cities who had the money, to say, I want my Central Park. And at this time, Buffalo was like the 10th largest city, and it was quite affluent. And so they said, you know what? We want that. And so they were like, how can we get Fred? So you had William Dorschmeyer, who was like, I know him. I'm going to write a letter. So I just try to think about how this is like in 1868. But anyhow, he said, I'm going to write a letter and I'm going to invite him. And then Sherman Jewett was like, I'll pay for it. Okay, I'm going to pay for all the accommodations. We got to bring him here. So he said, okay, on my way to Chicago, I can stop through. So they laid out the red carpet, showed them all around the city. So we could have our Central Park here, we could have our Central Park here. Afterwards, Frederick Law Olmsted said, you know what? You don't need just one park. You need like a coordinated park system. So Buffalo was like, okay, that sounds good, sure. And he was kind of thrilled because, you know, he tried to present this kind of ideal in Brooklyn, but Brooklyn was like, no, we just want Prospect Park. You're doing too much. You're doing too much with these parkways. Just one park. So he was excited that Buffalo was like, okay. So he said, okay, right here, we could start right here. This could be like the centerpiece. You already got this like 150 kind of acre meadow. This could be like the centerpiece. I'll just put some of my pastoral effects to it. This is what we'll start right here. Then he said, over here, I want to put the front. We need to have this for like the working class population because Buffalo, you know, is a hydroelectric industry town. So a lot of people live close to their jobs down on the water. So he said, I'm gonna have the park here also for, you know, waterfront activities. Then, you know, we're still kind of in this kind of post-war era. He said, I want to have the parade because we need this for military drills and for parades, you know, just in case we're going to break out in war again. And then later his son said, okay, you know what, we're going to change the name from the parade. We're going to call it Humboldt Park. And we're going to put this big old wading pond and pool in. And then eventually, as you know, it was changed to MLK Park. So after that, he said, okay, now I want to make sure that nobody ever leaves a green space. We got this is the northern park that he first established. He said, I want to make sure that you don't ever have to leave a green space. So if you leave the park, you can just go down Humboldt Parkway and then get to the parade. You never leave a green space, and hence you have this emerald necklace that he was trying to form. And so I put this here to tell you kind of the layout that he was envisioning. Now this next section is going to be called segregation by nature, and I basically say that I'm using that as a double entendre. So you can, and hopefully as I talk, you'll kind of get an understanding of what I mean by that. And so again, here's the northern part of the Buffalo Park system. But as you know, this is Main Street. Main Street is that sharp demarcation between west and east. Now what's interesting is Buffalo was not originally as segregated as it is today. Like I said, a lot of people were living down by the water, the working class, and you had German people living with black people, all in the same house. So it was much more integrated, but over time, it became segregated like the way we see it today, where 80% of Black Buffalonians live on the east side. And so the question is not so much why, but like how this came to be. And so what we see is that over time, you had these racist policies and planning that really instigated and churned the residential segregation that we see in Buffalo, as well as other cities. And one of those, specifically, was redlining. And so with redlining, which many of you have probably heard about, but not necessarily in the part that I'm going to kind of focus on today, in terms of green space, you had a situation where, well, first, to go back to kind of give you some understanding, you had the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was established because we were coming out of the Great Depression, and President Roosevelt was like, look, we need to figure out how to keep people in their homes. They're losing their homes left and right. So the HOLC was really established to really kind of provide new low interest rate mortgages. The mortgages beforehand were just horrible. They weren't amortized, like it was just horrible mortgages. Like you try to pay and then you would lose everything. So he wanted to refinance it so people could get low interest mortgages, and this was primarily targeted to have people stay in the homes that they already were in. Then there was another little pet project called the City Survey Program. And they deployed all these field agents to go talk to banks, to go talk to local lenders, talk to real estate agents, because they wanted to get an idea of what areas within the city were, quote, risky for mortgages, or to give people mortgages, and what areas were not as risky. And they went to about 239 cities to do this. And so not only they figured out what risky is, and it wasn't just about, okay, this is an old stock of home, or this neighborhood doesn't have amenities. This level or this scheme of risk was racialized. So basically, areas that were red, it wasn't a matter of just the houses were in poor condition. It was because there was communities of color who lived there. And so you had an area that was green, and that area was the premier area. That was the area where you had specifically native-born white people who lived there. And so they created the maps. But the real kind of, I call it the churning in terms of really putting the action of redlining, really came with the Federal Housing Administration, which was established about a year after the HOLC. Now, they were tasked with ensuring economically sound loans for people who wanted to buy a house, okay? So they basically said, because you know how banks were like a little nervous because we come out of depression, so they're like, we do not want to give mortgages to people. But when you got the federal government saying, we got you, we're going to insure it. They're like, okay, you going to insure it? Yep, we got you. But you got to follow all of our rules. You got to only give mortgages to the people who we say you can give it, in the areas you can say you give it. But don't worry, I got you a whole manual of how to do this. So you had the underwriting manual. You could actually pull down this manual right now and read the whole thing if you feel like it. You need something to put you to sleep at night. So you had this underwriting manual from 1938. And basically this manual had every section possible for how you can determine, yes, I will give you a mortgage, or no, I will not give you a mortgage. So you're like, okay, what does this have to do with green space and nature? You had this section right here. I don't expect you to be able to see it, but I just wanted you to see the density of what they're telling you and how specific they are. So basically, they say you can use natural or artificial established barriers will prove effective in protecting the neighborhood and the locations within it from adverse influences. Okay. And then they say, well, what's adverse influences? I'm going to tell you. The adverse influences are the infiltration of businesses or industry. That makes sense. Maybe you don't want a pig farm next to your house. Okay, that makes sense. But lower class occupancy and inharmonious racial groups. They just lay it out for you. Then they go on to tell you some examples. Public parks, hills, ravines, even a major thoroughfare. So right here you see that you have Main Street to keep you a nice barrier to protect from the park, or Delaware Park as we know today. So this was a tool that's how you could use green space as a way to kind of insulate and encapsulate these places that were deemed green versus areas that were red, they didn't have the same kind of investment. So this is an example of the area right around Delaware Park. And you can see who's in it. We have, well, first of all, it's beautifully landscaped, and there's parks, but there are no foreign-born, there are no Negroes, and most importantly, there's no infiltration. That's how you keep that area protected, and that's how the equity of those houses will increase and increase and increase. Then you got an area that's redlined. The stock of the houses, but look at the locations on the other side of Main Street and further down, further away from the main park. And then the people who are in there was porters and working class people, but it was 5% Italian, because also too, you had to be white and born in America, so you couldn't be a white immigrant. So it was 5% Italian, 95% Negro, and there was an infiltration of Negroes. Another example of which perpetuated segregation was urban renewal. Now, with urban renewal, or as Jimmy Baldwin said, Negro removal, you basically had this system where, well, actually, I'm going to pause for a minute and I'm going to go to a commercial break. This commercial break, I want to go back and I want to focus on Humboldt Parkway. I wasn't born when Humboldt Parkway was intact. I wish I was. But this is what it looked like, y'all. I mean, it was 2 miles long, 200 feet wide. I mean, just look at that bridleway that you could just walk down back and forth. My mom would talk about it, and she would talk about it in such a way I was like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I can't even envision how this was, because all I saw was the Kensington when I was born. So it's just beautiful. It's exquisite. It was the grandest of all of the parkways that Olmsted had designed. Okay, that was the commercial break. So I'm going to go back to this whole urban renewal. But before I go to that, I need to talk about the Interstate Highway Project. So we have the coming out of World War II, we had the proliferation of suburbs. Not only that, you had automania. Because if you're in the suburbs, you need a car. You can't if you're going from Amherst to downtown, you need a car. So you have more and more people, and sure, to have actually 2-car households. So what happens when you have more and more cars on the road? There's more traffic. And so you start to have more rumblings about the Federal Highway Acts, or the Interstate Highway Project. There was the first act that was, signed in 1944, but there was no money earmarked for it. So it's like it had no leg to stand on. But when Eisenhower was president, he really campaigned for this, because during when he was a lieutenant in the Army, he saw the Autobahn and he was like, this is what we need in America. If I become president, we're gonna have this. So when it was earmarked, when it was 1956 act was passed, he was like, okay, let's figure out how we're gonna pay for this. So they had this ingenious idea of like, what if we tax the gas that people need to drive their cars? And they're like, yes. So that way, pretty much almost every state could get pretty much a free highway. So they said, we'll cover 90% of the cost. Then they said, okay, you know what? If you apply for these urban renewal grants, you could cover up the difference. And these renewal grants are just pretty much a way to build other things, other public works projects, but often they were highways. So they said, we're going to use the highway to, quote, redeem or remove, repurpose these areas that are, quote, slum. And they were not slum, they were just disinvested areas, because they were the red line areas. They were the areas where you had communities of color. So you had a situation where cities were like, wow, I can get this highway built like for free, and this would be great, and it would make driving more efficient, especially in and out of the suburbs. So you had a situation where Buffalo was like, we're gonna get this highway, y'all. Where should we put it? Well, it wasn't that hard to decide. They said, we're just gonna excavate all of Humboldt Parkway, put it on the east side, and this is where we're gonna put our highway. With this 2-decade-long project, we see how devastating it was. It isolated the black community over there. You had this devastating green space loss. This beautiful aerial photo shows how beautiful it was when it was in full bloom. And you see how over years it was excavated, it was destroyed. And it took away these natural-based physical activity opportunities. And you may say, okay, what do you mean by that? So when you look at this picture, On the, your left, you see an intact Humboldt Parkway. And you see in that picture, there's a neighborhood deli. So you could easily just walk to the deli, get you a sandwich, a ham sandwich, get a pie, go walk and see some neighbors, walk back across the street, walk up and down the parkway. So it was great because you actually were like, I can walk to it. But you can't do that on the right because now you have a highway that is bifurcating this community. Another commercial break. I just want to make sure we're all on the same on the same page that nature is great for us. Nature has the best for physical and mental health benefits. There is a plethora of empirical research that has shown this over and over and over again. And so I just want to make sure we're on the same page that we need nature. Like, it's not a nice to have, we actually need it. But when you have situations where you don't have enough nature, you could have health inequities. And we see, this is not just an isolated incident in Buffalo. We see throughout the United States where you have communities of color who live in nature-deprived areas, they're more likely to have health inequities. So, Buffalo specifically, we look at the 2025 park score. This is a score that Trust for Public Land gives to a lot of cities. And they give a score basically to see how equitable your park distribution is, how equitable your park access is. And there's an overall score that they compile based on acreage, so how big they are, access, how much they've been invested, so are they kind of like shabby, the amenities of those parks, and then also equity. So that overall score is a 60, about 67. The higher the score, the better. When you look specifically at the inequity or the equity score, and specifically one piece of it that looks specifically at park distribution, our score is only 35. So what that is saying is that residents living in neighborhoods of color, specifically the East Side, have 50% less nearby park space than those living in white neighborhoods. When we look at trees, you can easily see this. This is very, probably anybody can interpret this in the sense that on the west side, it's all green. And then on the east side, you see a lot of orange. So basically, this is showing that when you look at specifically, like compare two different census blocks, this one that's a 99 is a low priority because they pretty much have achieved their tree canopy that they need. Whereas this census block, they're only at about 50% level. But what's equally important about the scores is not just, oh, you got trees or you don't have trees. It's about who also lives in those neighborhoods. So they prioritize the need for trees based on who lives there. So that census block with the 67 is 100% people of color, 20% unemployment, and a 75% poverty rate, which is not the case for the census block with that score of 99. So how does this translate to like active living inequities? Okay, I'm gonna go back to my commercial break because I really want to emphasize the physical activity. Because when you live near a park or green space, you're more likely to go there and walk there. Even if you just go walk and sit on the bench there, that's about 10 steps. And you get as many steps as you can during the day because we need all our steps. So it encourages physical activity. So we look again at Buffalo. All this blue, that's showing that's low walkability. And what do I mean by low walkability? Low walkability means there's no sidewalks. It means there's no easy way in, easy way out. It means there's low intersection. It means just all these factors that make it hard to walk. And one of them might be because you got a highway in the middle, whereas on the west side, you see red, where it's high walkability. Check out biking. Same situation. If you look at this figure right here, intricate bike network. So you got bike lanes, you got an easy, nice network to go biking. Whereas on this side, you don't see as many lines, so not as intricate of a network. And then you've got two lines along the expressway. I don't know who wants to bike along the 33, but in any case, that's what you have there. And so then it makes sense that you only got the four bike shops you have, they're on the west side. And then when you look at where you have bike racks, predominantly they're on the west side. So when you have these health inequities, you live in compromised conditions, and it can progress to be more and more deleterious to the point where you see health disparities. So you see an in proportion of people who have these adverse health outcomes. And so this is a map that shows on the east side it's darker blue, versus on the west side is lighter blue. So the darker blue means that there's more of a burden of physical and mental health outcomes, as reported, self-reported health outcomes. And one of those health outcomes is asthma. So with all of this red, you see that folks on the east side are in the 95th to 100th percentile for asthma prevalence. This is not compared to the west side. This is not compared to the entire city. This is not compared to New York State. It's compared to the entire United States, that they are in the 95th to 100th percentile. Very similar in terms of low life expectancy. You see folks here in the 95th to 100th percentile living a life where you have fewer years. So this final part that I'm going to go through is the next steps. I'm going to talk about the elephant in the room, or maybe the buffalo in the room. And we see that this is the Kensington Expressway. And so, again, y'all, I played with ChatGPT. And I was thinking, okay, what could happen? Like, what would it be like if we never had the Humboldt Parkway taken away? Or what would it look like if we could like reestablish it? And then I got carried away because I put in some wind turbines for sustainability energy. So I did get a little carried away. But I started to think about like what could actually happen, you know? And so we do know, just to kind of refresh us of what happened, you know, there's been decades of discussion about what should be done. And of course, the DOT previously said, you know what, we're gonna put a tunnel in. We're gonna put a tunnel between Sydney and Best. And, you know, we realized that's not gonna be a great idea. Because why? You're gonna have, first of all, it leaves out the fruit belt. But you're gonna emit all these other pollutants. And also, it's never gonna connect Delaware Park and MLK Park like it was before. Not to mention the tailpipe emissions that will come out of the tunnel from the portal ends. So when you increase the air pollution, you're going to increase the risk of all of these health outcomes, including premature death. So thanks to the Eastside Parkway Coalition, as well as the New York Civil Liberties Union, the Western New York Youth Climate Council, and at least 60 residential plaintiffs, they said, we're going to sue DOT. Now, they didn't sue them because of what I just told you about, oh, there's going to be these health implications, or, you know, you're leaving out the fruit belt. That wasn't the premise of the lawsuit. The premise of the lawsuit was basically, it's almost like telling your parents, you told me I should always do this, but you didn't do it. Remember how you used to say that to your parents? Like, you told me I should do this, but you're not even doing it. Well, that's pretty much the premise. So DOT, they pretty much did a Cliff Note version in terms of assessing what the environmental conditions would be if they have this tunnel. So instead of doing an environmental impact statement, they just did an environmental assessment. And so that was the premise of the lawsuit. And it was a wonderful win. It really was like showing how grassroots organizations can really come together and prevail. And so that's why we're starting fresh. That's to give you an understanding of why we're starting fresh. And they literally said, starting fresh. And I always put this little circle in because they even said one of the options could be filling it in. And that's kind of personally what I would want. Fill in and restore the Humboldt Parkway. And so they're saying, okay, we want to hear what y'all want to hear. We're having these listening sessions. Okay, I can talk offline about my opinions of that. But anyhow, they're having these listening sessions. The next one is March 5th. And thankfully, I think this one is within the city. But yes, it's on Main Street, the Buffalo Federation Neighborhood Center. So they want to hear your opinion, okay, of what should be done. And so as I end, I just want to talk about environmental reparations. I'm going to back up and say the word just reparation. Because a lot of times people hear the word reparation, they think, oh, you're going to cut me a check. It's just all about compensation. You're going to cut me a check, and I'm going to be straight. That is a very tangled web, and that's very complicated. But reparations can come in other forms. They can be environmental reparations. But you first have to acknowledge the harms and the wrong that you did. In the case of Buffalo, it was environmental racism. You could have different types of environmental justice. You could have targeted white communities, like, for example, the Appalachians. They got targeted when they tried to build the Shenandoah Park. So you could have different types of environmental justices. But in the case of Buffalo, I really do believe it was environmental racism. Then after you acknowledge, you have to say, you know what? We're going to restore you. We're going to make you whole again. And then you have to say, and we're not going to do it again. And that is the only way you're going to get environmental justice, in my opinion. So again, that was the proposed tunnel, in my opinion, incomplete reparation. And this is what it would look like with the full reparation. So I'm just going to do one little shout out. I am writing a book about this, published in late 2027. Book about this and so much more. But I just want to thank you all for your attention and for coming out this evening, and I'm open to any questions. I saw your hand first.
So just wanted clarification, because you had the chart up there about like the years and then the different countries and the amount of people, enslaved Africans that they had brought over. But like the difference between the United States is that they had chattel slavery. Like, did the other places have chattel slavery, or was it just us? That's one.
It varied. It varied. But you had some where the level of brutality, it varied. It varied by country to country. But yes, there was some that actually did have the chattel slavery as well. You know, and then you had some where it was kind of like a little bit like kind of leaning towards more indentured servant-ish. But it did vary by country to country. Yeah. Yes.
Yep, an interesting comment. I grew up in the Parkside neighborhood, and I'm an engineer and also a city planner. It wasn't until later I learned that I grew up in a purposefully mixed income neighborhood. We rented a flat that was really inexpensive. 2 blocks away were doctors' kids in big houses. So Olmsted was conscious of, for some reason, of economic integration. I benefited from it. But the racial part of that got totally left out. And I had no idea I grew up in the first purposefully planned mixed income neighborhood in the country.
And what community was that?
Parkside.
Parkside. Okay, yeah, Parkside. Yeah, so Olmsted, he's an interesting man. I mean, he was a man of his time in the sense that he did believe in, I think there was a quote saying, you know, he wanted the working class, the laborer, to be able to, you know, relax in a park and take in all the pleasures and, you know, the benefits of the park. But I think his understanding was the white laborer, you know, so it wasn't necessarily thinking about black laborers per se. However, and this is a big however, comma, he didn't believe in the brutality of enslavement. I mean, when he did his whole Cotton Kingdom tour, he didn't like what he saw. I think he didn't like what he saw for, one, economic reasons. He said, you're not going to get the best labor out of somebody if you're brutalizing them. So for economic reason, he didn't believe in that. And then he just didn't like the brutality. It's a big next step to say he believed in a white man and a black man being equal. And I don't feel comfortable saying that he did believe that, because I believe he was a man of his time. But I do believe kind of income, kind of integration, I could probably agree with you with that. Yes.
Do you believe that the Queen City Forward project, which is intended to design the future of the East Side, should be listening to people in Cheektowaga and Amherst?
You know, I'm glad you asked that question, because I noticed there was like a meeting in Gettsville and then one in Cheektowaga. You know, I do believe in a democratic voice. I do believe in a democratic voice. However, I do believe the primary people who need to be emphasized and actually catered to for these listening sessions are the people who are going to be impacted on the east side. So that's the main voice you need to hear. You can have some other folks come, yes, because they may actually co-sign, or maybe they may have a different thought of opinion, but I think the main opinion should be of the people on the east side. I have a lot of thoughts of how even these listening sessions should be held, but that's another whole issue. But, yeah.
It seems to me that Cheektowaga and Amherst contribute drivers. That's what they provide for the plan.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think people should get picked up on the east side. I really, and there should be, and I think it should be very deliberate in terms of how you have a campaign of going to hear folks. Because, and also too, it should be very much, in my opinion, more like a town hall meeting. From what I understand, it's like this long table, and it's kind of like speed dating or something. You're walking down, or I haven't gone to one. I've only seen pictures and heard. But I would like to have a town hall meeting. I think it would be great so you could hear people. They could share their stories. They could share about what they think. Like, so, you know, that's just my 2 cents.
Hi, Morgan. So I'm a fundamentally hopeful and optimistic person. I won't rule anything out. However, the narrative of your presentation kind of laid out this history of the foundation of America and American democracy being land dispossession and exploitation. So what reason do you have, or do we have, to think that reparations, restoration, and what was it? I forget. Those four.
Acknowledgement, yeah.
Yeah, acknowledgement. What reason do we have to believe that that is still possible?
You know what? Because I need to hold on to some optimism.
Yes.
I need to hold on to some optimism.
Yeah.
And I think when you got Eastside Pirate Club, we got people who are like, I mean, they went against the man, you know? And when you can sit, you need to be like, no, this is some optimism. And you also need to help people understand how you can give reparation. Like, this is a form of reparation. Because a lot of people are very narrow, like, oh, I don't know how I'm going to, like, okay, how am I going to write a check? Okay, so your great daddy, was he a slave? Okay, how many years? It's money. But when you have a parkway, it's not only just for the east side, it's for the whole city, you know? So yeah, I gotta hold on to some kind of optimism. Yeah. Did you have one, Brent?
Yeah, well, if you don't mind, you know, the idea of a town hall is really great. Eastside Parkway just had a town hall a couple days ago, 150 people there. And many of the same people is here. Many of the same people we see go into the listening sessions. And we've come through a few months of discussion. I'm from Eastside Parkways Coalition, like what to do about this now. And we've come to a consensus that it's massive engagement with the DOT to change the priority of their project from maintaining vehicular capacity to prioritizing the health of the neighborhoods.
Yes.
And our people are so good. You know, if you go to those listening sessions on the sticky note boards, there's always 95% it says prioritize the health of the community, fully restore Humboldt Parkway, all the way between the two parks. I'm convinced we can do this as a city. It has to be done. There's just no question that the tunnel, forget it. You know, we got this opportunity. We call it the great opportunity. We have a great opportunity. But we can only do it if the entire city gets involved and goes after these people. They stole that land. They stole it.
Yeah. Yep.
And we have an opportunity right now to get it back. So please, you know what I'm saying, everyone go to those listening sessions and say we want the entire thing back. We want to join the 198 and 33 projects because Humboldt Parkway went all the way between, you know, down both of those highways. Anyway, that's what we're putting down. Eastside Parkways Coalition, we meet the first and third Thursdays of every month. We hold like 40 events, and we are meeting this week, Thursday at Fitz Books in the evening. Sorry,
No,
but we
I'm
can
glad
do
you did
this.
that.
We can do it. We gotta all do it.
Obviously, that's its own set of issues. People have their own set of traumas from having to leave natural disaster areas. How do you think about balancing that with, obviously, there's short-term things that also need to be addressed in the current population of the community, but we're also talking about, some projections say like a doubling of the population of buffalo from climate-related migration and like what that looks like.
Well, I think I'd be quite surprised if it did double, but it's not. When I was born, the population was almost double, so yeah, it could happen. But I think it's almost like if you already start riding the bike with training wheels, you'll eventually be able to ride it without the training wheels. So something as simple as like we start with open concepts in the sense that you have the parkway, but you also need to have a light rail, so it can accommodate. So, and actually, even if the population did double, we don't want that vehicular demand. We want it so that when people come, we want it to be like New York City. We're like, I don't even own a car. I don't even know how to drive. You know what I mean? And so if you have that kind of culture that you change where we're not so car dependent like in Atlanta, where you can't go anywhere, then people will understand. Like when they come in, they already know that is the culture. It's like going to the Netherlands. You can buy a car if you want, but that tax is going to be ugly. So you better get your bicycle. So I think if you have that culture, we can be ready for that, if that was to happen. One more?
So I'm wondering if the parkway is restored, how will the people that actually live in that community resist the gentrification and displacement that will undoubtedly follow after that value goes back up?
So I think that's one of the things that's really important. Before you break ground, before you do anything, you have to have policies in place. You have to have all these things in place as like legally binding policies to make sure that folks are protected. And there are measures to help people in case the taxes will go up. But there are measures in place to protect them so that they can stay in their properties, so that the businesses can stay in the property. But also the other thing that I always think about in terms of displacement is not just the physical displacement, the cultural displacement. I want to keep that flavor. I want to keep, if we got, what's it, empty? I want empty to be there. I don't want Panera to come. No. So you got to make sure that's there too, but you got to have them ironclad policies, and you got to make sure the people who are overlooking, because some investors will come in and they'll be like, oh, you sure you don't want to Panera? No, we got empty. We got empty, that's okay. So I think that's very important. You can't ignore that. So that's a very good point though.
Thank you so much. Wonderful, thank you. Definitely a lot for all of us to learn and continue talking about in our beautiful city. If you would like to learn any more information about the Equity Alliance, I know I pointed to many of you to the QR code as you walked in, but if you haven't had a chance to scan it and you would like to begin receiving communications from us, please go ahead and do that. That's about our work here in Buffalo and also our trips when we go to Montgomery, Alabama and to the EJI. Thank you to all of you for coming out on a beautiful February evening. It was wonderful to all be together. Thank you.